In this program, you will learn about the California Gold Rush, how it spurred the settlement of the West and forever changed the lives of ordinary people. You will meet John Augustus Sutter, head of a plantation empire, and James Marshall, the man who first discovered gold in California. And you will encounter Red Cloud and Sitting Bull, two powerful Sioux chiefs who fought against General George Custer to defend their land against gold seekers in South Dakota. Even before gold was discovered in California in 1848, the West offered Americans a chance to live out their dreams. Men first went to the Oregon Territory and Northern California to seek their fortune as fur trappers, hunting beaver and selling the fur. California was still sparsely populated then. There were only about 7,000 Mexican settlers, and most were ranchers. California was originally part of the Spanish territory of Mexico. In the 1700s, Spain established a series of Catholic missions along the California coast, from San Diego up to San Francisco. In addition to their religious work, the missions developed big farms, which often used Indian labor to grow food and raise livestock. When Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, it took control of California and granted a few Mexican Californians large areas which they turned into huge cattle ranches. They, too, relied on Native Americans to do much of the hard work to run the ranches. In the early 1840s, a large-scale American migration began to the West. These people were called emigrants because they were leaving the United States to move to new territories. At first, people occupied lands in Oregon country, but soon emigrants began to leave the Oregon Trail near the Snake River and head for California. Many of the early American settlers to California had read of the exploits of John Fremont. Fremont, known as the Pathfinder, conducted topographical surveys of California and created maps which guided many people westward. Many of the early American settlers in California made their way to Sutter's Fort. Sutter's Fort was an agricultural empire owned by John Augustus Sutter. Sutter had come to America to escape debt. He made a prosperous new life in California. Sutter attained a grant of 50,000 acres of choice land where the Sacramento and American rivers meet.
One of the conditions of his Mexican land grant is that he needed to have families settle on his land to develop another plan by the Mexicans to populate the area. Most of the people in California, the Californios, the Mexicans of California, had their ranchos and they were living a wonderful life. So he sent press releases east that land could be had in California. Just come to New Helvetia and John would help you out. And he did, and people started to come.
As the American presence in California started to grow stronger, so did interest in making California part of the United States. When the United States officially went to war with Mexico in 1846, the Americans settled in California. U.S. forces, led by John Fremont, Colonel Stephen Kearny, and Commodore Robert Stockton, quickly defeated the Mexicans and declared California the property of the United States. On February 2, 1848, Mexico and the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which established the border of Texas at the Rio Grande River and took the vast California territory away from Mexico, giving it to the United States. Only 9 days before the treaty was signed, an event occurred that would stir the hopes not only of Americans, but people the world over. Gold was discovered. John Sutter, who had sided with the United States in their battle with Mexico, sent James Marshall, a New Jersey carpenter working for him, to supervise the building of a sawmill to cut trees into lumber. The sawmill had to be built on a river because the water current was needed to power the large wheel, which in turn moves the saw. Marshall went up the South Fork of the American River, about 45 miles north of Fort Sutter, into the Coloma Valley, and there he began construction of the sawmill. On January 24, 1848, Marshall took notice of the riverbed. He recalled, "My eye was caught by something shining in the bottom of the ditch. I reached my hand down and picked it up. It made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold. The piece was about half the size and shape of a pea. Then I saw another." Marshall took his shiny pellets to Sutter, and they tested them to be sure that they were in fact gold. One means of testing was to scrub the nuggets with soap. If the distinctive appearance of gold remained, it was genuine. The gold passed every test.
They decided it was wise to keep it a secret, not because they were after the gold all for themselves, but because Sutter had 1,200 acres in wheat ready to be harvested, and it was his fear he would lose all of his workers. Well, he did. They all went to the gold fields, including the Indians, because the Americans were hiring the Indians to help them pan for gold, and they could make a lot more money than Sutter was paying them. Because Sutter had nobody there to harvest the wheat, it rotted in the field, and it led to his bankruptcy, his selling out. He had to abandon everything. So the discovery of gold put Sutter out of business.
Sutter's plantation was quickly overrun with gold miners. Whatever Sutter had of value was stolen: his cattle, his food provisions, even the millstone in his grist mill. Gold was in abundance at or near the surface of riverbeds, in sandbars and gravel banks, and could be sifted using the simplest tools: shovels, picks, and pans. Some even used knives and spoons. The gold seekers scooped up riverbed silt into a pan and then washed water over it, which carried the lighter sand and pebbles away, leaving behind the heavier nuggets and flakes of gold. Each ounce was worth about $16. The amounts of gold uncovered by the first gold seekers were exceptional. For example, 7 men from Monterey used 50 Indians to dig up 273 pounds of gold from the Feather River in only 2 months. Men from other settlements throughout California and Oregon abandoned their farms and businesses to join the hunt for gold.
In May, a young entrepreneur, Mormon, by the name of Sam Brannan, who had come to California a year before, actually 2 years before, bought up every pick, shovel, wheelbarrow, hoe, pan, tool, anything involved in mining. He bought up all this stuff, came up, got a vial of gold, went back to San Francisco, and ran through the streets hollering, "Gold! Gold on the American!" And that started the rush. Well, where were they going to get the tools? They had to buy them from Brannan.
By mid-June 1848, 3/4 of the men in San Francisco left the town to find gold, leaving stores empty, schools closed, and ships docked because their workers had deserted them. By late summer 1848, newspapers back east began to reprint stories from California papers about the discovery of gold. They printed letters from miners telling of their successes. Many Easterners doubted these claims until President Polk confirmed the stories in December of that year. Soon, fortune seekers arrived in California from all over the United States and the world, including Europe. Ships traveling from California to Hawaii, Mexico, South America, and China all brought back gold hunters as well as supplies to sell. Most of these men expected to return home as soon as they struck it rich. For many years, there were very few women who made the trip to California.
This began to change, and they tried to bring more women settlers out to California. California, for example, was the first American state to pass a law that would allow married women to retain the property they owned before they were married. And this was a big deal because that brought women out to California realizing that once they got married, they would still retain their property rights.
Gold seekers had a choice of traveling to California by land or sea. Both were treacherous. Travelers might choose to sail to Panama and take a separate ship north to California. They risked disease and other hardships on the long journey. Many chose to travel overland on the California Trail. Those who timed their trips poorly risked freezing to death in the Sierra Nevada mountains if they got to them after September. Despite the dangers facing anyone attempting to make the journey, the mass migration to California continued throughout 1849. Those who embarked on the mass migration were called 49ers. They were said to have caught gold fever because they succumbed to the desire for instant wealth that made farming and most other occupations seem unappealing by comparison.
What the settlers thought, the people who moved out west, the immigrants out west, believed from the stories was that you went there a poor man, and overnight you were fabulously wealthy. There were large amounts of gold, and you could settle there and become rich beyond all your expectations overnight. What they discovered for the most part was it was very tiny amounts of gold, what they called gold dust.
One gold seeker called this gold fever the beginning of our national madness, our insanity of greed. The miners were not the only ones who were motivated by greed. So too were the merchants. As some 80,000 people swarmed into California in 1849 looking for gold, prices for everything soared. It has been said that a pair of boots which cost $2.50 in the East sold for $20 in California. Gambling halls, saloons, and other entertainment sites appeared virtually overnight, and many men spent all of their gold dust there.
Many people went away broke. The people that did make money, though, were the business people. The people that could sell watermelons or tomatoes or potatoes or squash, lettuce, people who were raising beef. Those were in great demand because these miners that were showing up in 49 and 50 literally had nothing but was on their back.
Wherever gold was found, boomtown settlements sprang up. The men set up tents and wooden shanties as their only protection against the weather. Many of these instant towns disappeared as soon as the gold was mined out. The gold miners spent long, hard hours digging and sifting as ice-cold torrents of water came down from the mountains and the sun beat down. Their boots and clothes rotted away, their hands blistered. Heavy rains would wash away the dams they built, forcing them to start all over again. Many of the gold seekers who left their homes in 1849 did not make it to the digging sites until 1850, by which time much of the surface gold had been removed. It took teams of men to wring any new gold from the earth. The miners built contraptions called long toms that were between 8 and 15 feet long. With a steady stream of water channeled into them, the long toms would sift dirt much more efficiently, but for many, this still yielded little or no gold. Even as the gold strikes became less frequent and less abundant, people still crowded the rivers and nearby digging sites. Since 1848, when California became the property of the United States, Congress had been discussing what should be done with the territory. Because of its population explosion, California petitioned the United States for immediate statehood. The political status of California became a major source of controversy throughout the United States. Nationally, the question was asked whether California would be admitted to the Union as a slave state or a free state. California drew up a state constitution that banned slavery, primarily to prevent miners from having to compete against slave labor in the diggings. African Americans in California, however, were not granted full rights of citizenship. California's petition for statehood heightened the already simmering tensions in Congress between slave states and free states. Finally, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay helped to create what came to be known as the Compromise of 1850.
California was admitted as a free state, in other words, no slaves, and in return, the United States passed very severe fugitive slave laws that were expected to be enforced throughout the country. Also, black settlers in California were given no political rights.
In the meantime, the American miners in California pressured the state government to prevent the influx of foreign miners from claiming gold the Americans felt was rightfully theirs.
the Mexicans, the Chileans, the Australians, the Europeans, the Chinese that were coming in, the Hawaiians. What about all of these people? Well, the Americans were able to get, in 1850, California was able to pass a law that taxed these people. $20 a day was to tax these people, to try to discourage them.
No group suffered worse than the Chinese. Chinese dwellings were burnt down, and some Chinese were beaten and murdered. Few of these crimes were punished. While most white American settlers did not advocate open violence against the Chinese, few felt much sympathy for their plight. The situation was not much better for non-whites who were born on U.S. soil. African Americans had few legal protections for their property and could not vote in elections. Meanwhile, American Indians without jobs were declared vagrants and forced to work at the digging sites for very little money. The foreigners and American Indians were often targets for the frustrations felt by many of the 49ers. As the gold stakes played out, many people left California bitterly disappointed. Very few found the wealth they sought. Instead, most of them found poverty and loneliness. As the California diggings yielded less and less wealth, gold fever was sparked again by the discovery of gold in the Colorado Rockies, Montana, Oregon, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and the Dakota Territory. Many of these gold sites lay on Indian territory, guaranteed by treaty with the United States. Nevertheless, Americans descended upon these sites and forcefully drove the Indians out. The often strained relations between American Indian tribes and the U.S. government were about to take a significant turn for the worse. The Sioux War of 1865 to 1867 broke out after the U.S. government announced its intention to build a road through the foothills of the Black Hills. The purpose was to connect new gold mining settlements to the east. The road-building project cut through sacred Indian grounds, including their primary area for hunting. A Sioux Indian chief named Red Cloud, who was generally on friendly terms with the U.S. government, warned that there would be resistance if the project went ahead. This sparked 2 years of continuous bloody warfare. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty was created. The treaty gave the Indians an area called the Great Sioux Reservation, which encompassed half of present-day South Dakota, including the Black Hills.
The idea was to remove the Indians from areas where whites wanted to settle, and in return, the Indians would be given food rations and be recognized as independent negotiating powers with the United States because they had no rights as American citizens at that point in history.
Red Cloud accepted the terms of the agreement. His faction, his own small group of Sioux Indians, came to be called the Treaty Indians. Another faction of the Sioux, however, refused to make any concessions to the whites. Under the leadership of Sitting Bull, they were called the Non-Treaty Indians. The non-treaty faction included a famed Oglala Sioux warrior named Crazy Horse, who led Indian forces to ambush an entire command of soldiers outside a fort in Wyoming. The non-treaty Indians refused to stay on the Great Sioux Reservation. By the early 1870s, gold fever came to the Black Hills. Rumors spread quickly that there was gold in the Black Hills on the Great Sioux Reservation. Another round of armed conflict with the Indians lay just around the corner. In 1874, George Armstrong Custer led over 1,200 men on what was called a scientific expedition into the Black Hills to look for gold. Custer was known for his reckless bravery and harsh leadership style. When Custer's troops succeeded in finding gold, word got out, and miners streamed in to strike it rich in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Custer sought to increase his fame in the Dakotas by fighting the Indians. The U.S. Army was supposed to remove any white trespassers from the reservation, but gold seekers soon overwhelmed them. Since Custer's sympathies were with the gold miners, he threatened to punish any Indians who resisted the miners. Before full-scale war broke out again with the Sioux Indians, the United States government tried to buy or lease the Black Hills from them. Sitting Bull's non-treaty Indians aggressively opposed the negotiations. The government demanded that these non-treaty Indians leave the hunting grounds. Sitting Bull refused.
They maintained that they had the right to maintain grounds that were sacred to them. The white man had no right on there, and therefore they promised to fight anybody that tried to put them off of their land.
In the meantime, the treaty Indians continued to seek a peaceful settlement. The treaty Indians demanded that the United States government supply substantial amounts of food and housing to them, but the government deemed the proposals too costly. General Philip Sheridan, a famous Civil War general, drew up a plan of attack. 3 separate columns of soldiers would enter the unceded territory from a different direction, and whichever one found Sitting Bull and his followers would destroy them. On June 25, 1876, Custer brought his troops into the valley of the Little Bighorn River and split his forces, hoping to surround Sitting Bull's faction. However, he didn't know that many treaty Indians came to join Sitting Bull and his non-treaty Indians to fight the whites, and their numbers swelled to 6,000. As Custer's troops rode down from a ridge into the valley, the Indians overwhelmed and killed them. The disaster at Little Bighorn caused the Americans to intensify their military campaign against the Indians. Eventually, with superior numbers and more advanced weaponry, the Americans won out. Sitting Bull refused to surrender. Instead, he escaped to Canada, refusing to give up his way of life. He vowed, "I will remain what I am until I die, a hunter. And when there are no buffalo or other game, I will send my children to hunt and live on prairie mice, for where an Indian is shut up in one place, his body becomes weak." After the defeat of the Sioux, the Americans restricted Indian tribes to smaller and smaller pieces of land in reservations. The surviving Indians lived in poverty. Their hunting grounds became almost barren, as their primary game, buffalo, were hunted to near extinction.
They were completely dependent on anything the United States government would grant them, whatever little that was. And it was not for many years that Indians enjoyed the same rights as citizens that the rest of the country did.
When Americans moved out west, they dreamed of attaining lives of ease.
Gold fever definitely infected the United States. It captured the imagination of everybody. People left by the thousands. In 1849, it's estimated that maybe upwards of 40,000 people left the Midwest and the East coming overland. Another 50 or 60,000 came by sea, and they all arrived in California looking for their fortunes.
Instead, they largely found disappointment. Still, the American people did fill out the country's natural borders, spreading from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and farther north and south than the nation's founders had ever thought possible. On January 24, 1848, James Marshall discovered gold near Sutter's Mill on the banks of California's American River. People were said to have caught gold fever, and those who embarked on the mass migration for gold were called 49ers. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty was created, giving the Indians an area called the Great Sioux Reservation. In the early 1870s, gold was discovered on the Great Sioux Reservation, and gold seekers overwhelmed the reservation in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. On June 25, 1876, General George Custer and his troops were defeated by Sitting Bull and his non-treaty Indians at the Battle of Little Bighorn.